The first thing Clem Hale noticed that morning was the silence of her chimney. He stood at the edge of his own yard in the gray light before sunrise breath coming out in thick white clouds, the cold pressing against his face with the particular intimacy of a January that meant business. Across the frozen ground, maybe 40 yards, the small cabin sat against the November sky like a thing already defeated. No smoke rose from it, no trace of gray curling upward into the pale dark. Nothing. He had seen no smoke since 9 the previous evening. He stood there for a moment, a man of 52, with the particular stillness of someone who has just confirmed what he expected to confirm. And the confirmation did not make him feel good the way being right was supposed to feel good. He crossed the yard. His boots broke through the thin crust of the overnight freeze, with each step the sound sharp and rhythmic in the silence. He reached her door. He raised his hand to knock. Then he stopped. He pressed his palm instead against the stone wall beside the door. He stood like that without moving for a long moment, his hand flat against the limestone, and the limestone pressed warmth back into his skin. Not the sharp heat of a stove recently loaded, not the radiating blast of iron that had been burning hard. Something slower than that. Something that had been there all night, steady as a heartbeat, patient as the earth it came from. He did not pull his hand away. He stood there in the November dark with his palm against a dead woman's wall, and felt it give warmth back to him, and he did not know what to do with that feeling, so he stood there and let it keep happening. But to understand what Clem Hale was feeling in that moment, you have to go back 3 months. You have to go back to August, to the dust and the heat and the flat prairie light, to the day a woman named Nell Whitmore came north with a mule and a trunk and a set of shoulders that had been carrying hard work for so long. They had simply become the shape of her. She was 63 years old. She had been born in 1818 in a farmhouse in Ohio, the third daughter of a man who believed that women learned by doing and who had accordingly let her do everything. She had learned to read the sky before she learned to read a page. She had learned to feel the quality of soil through the sole of a boot before she could name the counties of her state. By the time she was 20, she could tell you whether a field would drain or hold by the way it smelled after rain. And by the time she was 30, she had a farm of her own, with a husband named George, who worked alongside her with the quiet partnership of a man who understood that the woman beside him knew things he did not know, and was grateful for it. George had been gone since April, a fever swift and indifferent. 3 days from health to stillness, the way those fevers move through a body in the spring when the ground was still cold and the air had not yet decided what season it wanted to be. She had sat with him. She had done what could be done, which was not enough, which it was never enough, when a fever decided to take someone. And then she had buried him in the Iowa ground. They had worked together for 31 years. And she had stood at the grave in the April wind and understood something that she would not have been able to put into words, but that changed the direction of every remaining day. She was not staying, not because the land was wrong, not because the neighbors were unkind, but because the farm without George in it was a shape she could not live inside, a shape built for two that fit one person badly. And she was 63 years old. And she was not going to spend whatever time she had left rearranging her life around the absence of a man when there was still something to build. She heard about the land in the north from a man at the feed store. Cheap, he said. The reason it was cheap was that the winters were cruel in a way that the winters further south were not. Wind off the open prairie with nothing between it and you. For 100 miles, temperatures that dropped to places iron had opinions about cold, that got into log cabins through every gap and gap, adjacent surface, and settled at floor level where the children slept. She had listened. She had asked 2 questions. She had packed what she could carry and sold what she could not, and come north in August with a mule she named Patience, and a trunk and a small leather notebook that had belonged to George, and that she had filled in the months since his death with figures and drawings and measurements that would have looked strange to anyone who opened it, but that made complete sense to her. The settlement was a loose collection of claims in the flat country north of the river. 9 families, maybe 10 if you counted the Granger situation on the eastern edge, and a small gathering of buildings that aspired to be a town, but had not yet made up its mind. There was a general store, a blacksmith, and a man named Rutherford Dean, who occupied a building with a painted sign that said, "Land and Commerce," in the careful lettering of a man who wanted to be taken seriously. Dean was 55. He wore a coat that was never dirty, which in that country in that year was a statement. He had the face of a man who did arithmetic constantly, not because he loved numbers, but because numbers were how he understood people, what they were worth, what they owed, what they could be persuaded to believe about their own futures. He smiled with the patience of someone who was waiting for a process to complete, rather than feeling a genuine emotion. He showed Nell the available land with the practiced tour of a man who has given this tour before. The cheapest parcel was at the edge of the settlement, north facing the soil thin over limestone. The structure on it, a cabin that the previous owner had abandoned after one winter. He mentioned this last detail in a neutral voice that contained no judgment and no warning, only information. The kind of information that a person with experience would weigh, and a person without experience might not fully register. Nell registered it. She walked the claim before she said anything. She walked it slowly. The way she walked everything with the attention of someone reading rather than looking. She pressed her boot into the soil at intervals. She crouched once near the western edge where a seam of limestone came close to the surface, and pressed her palm against the rock. She stood for a long moment in the wind that came across the open ground from the north. Then she went back to Dean and asked about the contract. He produced it from his folio with the easy familiarity of a document he knew well. 4 pages. He went through the main provisions with the smooth patter of a man who had explained the same document many times and had learned which parts to emphasize and which parts to pass over, in a tone that suggested they were standard and unremarkable. The price, the terms of payment, the conditions of occupancy. He turned the pages at a pace that was just slightly faster than careful reading required. The clause was on page 4. Nell read it. She read it twice. She read it the way her father had taught her to read anything important, looking not just at what it said, but at what it was designed to do. The clause stated that if the claim did not meet settlement standards of improvement and habitation by the 1st of March of the following year, the seller retained the right to repurchase the property at 60% of the original sale price. Dean explained the clause in the same neutral tone. Standard for the territory, he said. Protection for the settlement against abandoned claims. He said the previous owner had left before winter, and the clause had allowed the land to return to productive use. He said it with the face of a man performing charity. Nell looked at the contract for a long moment. She knew what the clause meant. She understood that she was being shown a door that had been used before, and that she was being invited to walk through it. She also understood that she had $140, that the land here was the cheapest available within 2 days' travel in any direction, and that she was 63 years old and had already made the decision to come north. The clause was a risk. The alternatives were worse risks. She signed. She spent the rest of August looking. Not at the cabin, though. She assessed the cabin the same way she assessed everything walking its perimeter, testing its logs, checking the way the ground drained away from the foundation. The cabin was adequate, 16 feet by 18. pine logs, low roof, packed earth floor. She was not going to live in it as it stood, but she was going to live in it as it could be made to stand, which was a different and more interesting problem. What she was looking at was stone. The creek to the west ran through limestone country. The bed was crowded with its flat pieces and round pieces, and the long horizontal slabs that broke cleanly when you knew where to strike. She walked the creek bank for 3 hours the second day and came back with her notebook full of measurements and a clear picture of the geometry she was working toward. She started hauling stone on the 1st of September. The mule earned its name that month. Every morning before the heat of the day, she went to the creek with the sledge and loaded what she could and brought it back to the claim. She was not hurrying. She was calculating. The mass she needed required a specific quantity of stone of specific dimensions, and she had done this arithmetic in the notebook, and she knew the number. And she was working toward it the same way she worked toward every number one day at a time. The neighbors noticed. The settlement had the specific social quality of a place where people had come from elsewhere and had not yet developed the trust that made them mind their own business. They watched Nell haul stone with the open attention of people observing a weather event curious and slightly suspicious. They came by the claim in the afternoons and stood at the edge of the yard and looked at what she was building. The stone went against the north wall of the cabin interior, field stones stacked thick. She mixed her mortar by hand, clay, and sand in a proportion she had worked out over years of watching what held and what did not, working animal hair into the mixture until it became something close to woven. She set the largest pieces at the base, where the weight would be greatest, and worked upward with a patience that was not performing patience, but actually was patience the real kind. The kind that came from understanding that some things could not be rushed without being ruined. By the second week of September, the wall's purpose had become visible enough that the comments began. Clem Hale was the loudest. He was a big man, broad in the chest, with the easy confidence of someone who had done the same things successfully for long enough that success had started to feel like inevitability. He had been in the settlement 3 years, which made him among the more established residents, and he wore this minor seniority with the particular comfortable authority of a man who believed that knowing a place for 3 years meant understanding it. He stood at the edge of her yard one afternoon with 3 other men and looked at the wall going up inside the cabin and said the thing that everyone else was thinking. That is firewood turned into a grave. Nell was mixing mortar. She did not look up. She continued mixing with the slow, circular motion she had found most effective, pressing the material against the sides of the mixing trough until it reached the consistency she wanted. One of the women asked where she was planning to sleep. Nell straightened up. She looked at the wall, not at the woman. She looked at it the way a carpenter looked at a nearly finished thing, assessing the remaining work. Then she picked up the next stone. Clem said something else to the men beside him, something quieter, something that produced a low laugh. She did not respond to the laugh either. She had understood since she was a young woman that certain kinds of mockery required engagement to keep burning, and the cleanest way to put it out was to give it nothing to feed on. She kept working. It was on the 3rd day of this on an afternoon when the light was golden, and the air had the first real edge of autumn in it, that a different visitor came. Silas Granger was 68 years old, which made him the oldest person in the settlement by several years. He had come north 20 years ago under circumstances he had never fully explained to anyone, and he had stayed through winters that took others out through years that taught him the specific and unforgiving vocabulary of this country. He was not a large man. He had the compacted quality of someone who had spent decades removing everything unnecessary from how he moved through the world, keeping only what was useful. He came to the edge of the yard, and he looked at the wall inside the open cabin door for a long time, without speaking. Then he said, "Where did you learn this?" Nell looked at him. She had heard the quality of the other visitor's attention, the social curiosity mixed with judgment, and this was a different quality. This was a man looking at what she was building the way she looked at limestone seams for information. She said from the ground. He stood there for another moment. He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man confirming something he had suspected. Then he left. She thought that was the end of it. She went back to work, pleased with the afternoon's progress, her hands settling into the rhythm of setting stone. She was calculating the firebox dimensions in her head, the specific size and placement that would send heat into the mass of stone rather than up and out, and she was satisfied with the calculation. An hour later, she heard boots on the ground behind her. She turned. Silas Granger was standing at the cabin door again. He was holding a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her. She took it. She looked at him. He said, "Keep that." He did not explain what it was. He turned and walked back across the open ground toward the eastern edge of the settlement, the deliberate, unhurried walk of a man who had made a decision and was done with it. Nell looked at the paper. She unfolded it carefully. It was a document. Old the paper, soft with age, at the fold, lines the ink still clear. A land ordinance, federal, dated from the original settlement mandate for the territory. She read it. She read it carefully. Then she folded it again and went inside and put it in the trunk with the notebook and the $40 she had in coin. She did not take it out again that evening, but she thought about it while she worked, and she thought about it while she cooked, and she thought about it in the specific way. She thought about things that were important but whose importance she could not yet fully see, turning it in her mind the way she turned stone in her hand before setting it, feeling for what it told her about itself. October arrived. The wall grew. She carved the sleeping hollow herself, working with the specific knowledge of someone who had slept in cold rooms for 63 years and understood what a body needed in order to stay warm through the night. The hollow was 58 inches long, deep enough for a person to lie fully inside. The back wall and the ceiling and the sleeping platform were all stone, all part of the continuous mass. She fitted a pine panel on iron hinges that closed flush against the outside face of the wall. From the room, it looked like a pantry door. From inside, once the stone had been loaded with the heat from a properly built fire and given the hours it needed to absorb and hold and begin its slow release, it felt like something she did not have a word for, like being held by something patient and massive and entirely indifferent to the cold outside, like being inside the argument against winter rather than outside it. She tested the hollow in the 3rd week of October, before the cold was serious. She fed the firebox for 2 hours with hardwood split fine and stacked tight the way she had learned the way the fire burned hot and clean and drove heat into the stone rather than sending it up the flue. Then she let it die. She closed the pine panel and lay down inside the hollow in the dark. The stone was warm against her back. Not blazing. Not sharp. Warm the way things were warm, when they had been warm for a long time, and had settled into a stable temperature that they would hold through the hours. She lay there in the dark inside the wall and listened to the wind that was beginning to build outside the first serious wind of the autumn, and she felt the sound of it against the stone, the way you felt a distant storm when you were already inside shelter. Mabel Hale came by one afternoon in the last week of October. Mabel was 48. Clem's wife, a compact woman with quick eyes who moved through any situation by observing it first and forming opinions second. She came alone without announcing herself, and she stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked at the finished wall for a long moment. Then she stepped inside. She reached out and placed her hand flat against the limestone. She did not say anything. She stood there with her hand on the stone and her head slightly tilted, the attitude of a person listening to something. Then she said, "It holds it well." Nell was at the table, not looking up from the notebook. She said yes. Mabel moved her hands slowly along the surface. She was feeling something specific, the quality of the warmth, the evenness of it. She pressed her palm to one section and then another. She said, "My husband says you'll freeze." Nell said, "Your husband may be right." Mabel looked at her. There was something in Nell's expression. Not challenge, not dismissal. Only the calm of a person who had done a calculation and was willing to wait for the result. Mabel said, "But you don't think so?" Nell said, "I think the stone will tell us." Mabel left without saying more. But she came back the following afternoon with a quarter of a pie wrapped in cloth and set it on the table and left before Nell had fully turned around. November arrived with the first real cold, not the test cold of October. The practice cold, the cold that arrived for a few days and retreated. This was the November cold of the northern plains, the kind that settled in like an occupant who had paid the rent and intended to stay until April. Wind came off the open ground from the northwest, with nothing between it and the settlement but flat miles of frozen grass. And it found every weakness in every structure, with the thoroughness of an appraiser looking for reasons not to pay. In the 9 other cabins, the morning routines adjusted themselves to the cold. Men rose before light to feed stoves that had burned low overnight. Women blew on coals and added wood, and held children in blankets near the heat source until the room came back to something livable. The pattern was the same in every house. Burn hard at night. Wake in the dark, rebuild the fire, wait for warmth, begin the day. Nell's chimney burned hard for 3 hours each evening. Then it went dark. By the 3rd morning of the cold, the settlement had noticed. Clem Hale was the one who said it first over morning coffee at the general store. The comment delivered to the room with the ease of a man stating something obvious. He had seen her chimney go out at 9 the previous night. He had seen no smoke this morning. By now, on the 3rd morning, the math was simple. A cabin with no fire in that cold was a cabin where someone had run out of wood or out of options or out of something more fundamental. The general store produced 2 men willing to go check. They did not run. They walked at the pace of people performing a duty they already understood the outcome of, the brisk, purposeful walk of men going to confirm something before it became someone else's problem to manage. Clem was one of them. They crossed the frozen ground between the cabins as the sky began to lighten in the east. The pale gray light of a cold morning that promised no warmth. The cabin sat low against the sky. No smoke. No movement visible through the small window. Clem reached the door first. He raised his hand. Then he stopped. He pressed his palm against the stone wall that he had said was firewood, turned into a grave. He stood there, without moving. The stone pushed warmth back into his skin, not the warmth of a fire burning behind it, not the residual heat of something that had burned recently, the warmth of something that had been warm all night and intended to go on being warm, regardless of whether anyone was tending it. The warmth of a mass that had been loaded with heat the previous evening and was releasing it now with the slow patience of stone, doing what stone did, holding and giving and holding and giving, indifferent to the clock. He stood there with his hand flat against the limestone, and he did not speak. The other man raised his hand to knock. The door opened before he touched it. Nell Whitmore stood in the doorway in her work clothes. hair loose, bare feet on the earthen floor. Her cheeks had color. Her eyes were clear. She looked at the two men on her step with the mild attention of someone who had been expecting company eventually. The other man said, "We thought you might be in trouble." She looked at him. Then she looked past him at Clem, who was still standing with his hand against the stone. She said, "Give it a moment." She stepped back from the doorway. Clem came forward and pressed his hand against the interior face of the wall, the side that faced the small table and the cold fireplace. He held it there. The warmth came into him steadily without the drama of a recently burning fire, with the reliability of something that had not started and stopped and required maintenance, but had simply continued. Then the hinge on the pine panel creaked. The small door opened. A breath of warmer air drifted out into the room. Nell stepped down from the sleeping hollow. Her feet found the floor. She straightened. She reached up and closed the pine panel with the familiar ease of someone performing an ordinary morning action. She looked at the two men. Clem took his hand off the wall. He looked at the firebox, cold now. Ash gray, no trace of ember. He looked at the wall. He looked at the firebox again. He said nothing. He stayed. The other man left. He had seen enough and had a family waiting. But Clem pulled the chair from the table and sat down in it without being asked, and looked at the wall as the morning light grew in the window. Nell made coffee. She set a cup in front of him. She sat across the table and did not explain anything. She did not feel the need to explain things. The wall was there. The coffee was hot. The fire had been dead for 8 hours, and the room was still the room of someone who had slept well. The hours passed. Nell fed the livestock. She came back. She worked at the table with her notebook. Clem sat and watched the wall the way he had watched difficult things before, with the attention of a man who had decided that the thing was real and was trying to understand how it was real. In the late afternoon, she loaded the firebox again. Fine hardwood split dry, stacked with intention. The fire came up fast and bright and clean, not the lazy, spreading fire of someone burning green wood. The focused fire of someone burning the right wood, the right way. It drew inward, pulling through the channels she had built into the mass, heating the stone rather than the air. He leaned forward and looked at the firebox opening. It was smaller than his own stove at home, but the sound was different. The fire didn't spread. It reached. After a time, he said, "You're not heating the air." She looked at him. He said, "You're heating the stone." She said, "Yes." He sat back. He looked at the wall that he had called firewood turned into a grave, and he was quiet for a long time, and the fire burned for 3 hours, and she let it burn down without touching it again. And when the last flame thinned to coals, she rose and closed the pine panel over the hollow, and he understood from watching her do it that this was how it was every night. Fire and stone and dark and warmth that lasted because the stone had been given the time to take it in. He did not leave when the fire went out. He sat at the table in the quiet cabin as the night deepened outside, as the wind found the settlement and pressed against every log and board and gap with the familiar violence of a northern November that had been doing this work for 10,000 years and knew every weakness. He pressed his hand against the wall at midnight, still warm. He pressed it again at 3 in the morning. The warmth had not retreated. He sat there until the pale light came back to the window, and Nell opened the pine panel from inside and stepped down from the hollow with her hair loose and her feet bare on the floor. That was cool, but not cold. And the fire had been dead for 8 hours, and the wall had not finished giving back what it had been given. He stood up slowly. He walked to the wall. He placed his palm flat against it one more time. He held it there. The warmth came into his hand steady as a heartbeat. He turned and looked at her. He had come to her door 2 days ago with the comfortable certainty of a man who had been right about everything in this country for 3 years. He had called her wall a grave. He had laughed with other men at the edge of her yard, and the laugh had felt true at the time, the natural response of an experienced person watching an inexperienced one make an expensive mistake. He looked at her now, and he did not have that certainty anymore. He had sat through the night watching a dead fire keep a room warm, and whatever he had believed before that night was not adequate to explain what he had watched. And he was a man who, underneath the easy confidence, took accuracy seriously. He said, "How much stone would it take?" She looked at him. He said, "To build one of these." "In my house." She was quiet for a moment. Then she went to the trunk and took out the notebook. She set it on the table and opened it to a page of measurements and angles and the proportions she had worked out over months of thought and testing. She found a blank page at the back. She took a pencil. She began to draw. Outside, the November wind worked against the settlement with the patience of something that would outlast all of it. The cabins and the families and the careful stores of firewood and the iron stoves glowing red. Everything that the people of that place had built against the cold. It had been doing this before any of them arrived, and it would be doing it after. It did not know that inside one small cabin on the north edge of the settlement, a wall of limestone was holding heat through the 8th hour of a dead fire, while a woman drew diagrams on paper, and a man who had laughed at her watched the pencil move. Clem left at sunrise. He took the diagrams with him folded carefully inside his coat, and he went without ceremony, without the kind of speech a man made when he had learned something that cost him something to learn. He pulled the door closed behind him. Nell heard his boots on the frozen ground diminishing across the yard, and then the sound of his own door, and then nothing but the wind. She stood at the table for a moment after he left. The fire had been dead since before midnight. She had not rebuilt it. She would rebuild it at dusk the way she always did, the 3-hour burn that sent heat into the stone, and the stone would hold it through the next night, the way it had held it through every night since the first hard cold came. The system worked. It had worked in the testing and it worked in the practice, and it would keep working as long as she fed it correctly and did not ask it to do something it was not designed to do. She made her breakfast. She went out to the mule. The settlement was quiet in the way that settlements were quiet the morning after the first serious cold of a season, everyone occupied with the interior work of adjusting to a new reality, checking stores, counting what remained, calculating what would be needed. She could see smoke from most chimneys already, the morning fires being built back up from the overnight coals, and she registered the sight with the specific attention of someone who understood what it meant in terms of wood consumption and the mathematics of a long winter. Most of those chimneys would smoke all day. Hers would be dark by 9 in the evening. She did not think about Clem Hale as she worked. She had understood for a long time that other people's opinions of her methods were information at best and interference at worst, and she had learned to receive information without letting it alter her course, unless it revealed something she had not previously accounted for. Clem's skepticism had not revealed anything she had not already considered. His experience of the wall the previous night was the beginning of a different kind of conversation, but she was not going to rush that conversation. It would happen at the pace it happened. The days moved into December. The cold settled in with a permanence that changed the texture of everything the way cold did in the north when it had decided to stay for a season rather than making a visit. Water froze in buckets left indoors overnight. Breath became visible before a person had fully woken. The ground underfoot had the particular hard ring of earth that had given up its give and would not get it back until April at the earliest. In most of the settlement cabins, the pattern of the nights became a rhythm of interruption. Men rose in the dark to feed stoves. Women adjusted layers around children who had migrated toward the heat source in their sleep. The iron stoves loaded heavy before bed burned through their fuel in the hours before dawn, and let the rooms cool in the last dark hours so that by the time the household was fully awake, the room had a temperature that required rebuilding before it was comfortable. In her cabin, Nell slept straight through. She built her evening fire at dusk, fed it for 3 hours closed. The panel went inside the hollow. The stone held through the night without requiring anything from her. When she opened the panel in the morning, the room was not what it had been at midnight. The stone gave its heat over the course of the night, and the curve of that release was not flat. By 3 in the morning, the room was cooler than it had been at 9, but it was not the sharp cold that greeted people in the other cabins. Not the cold that lived at floor level and climbed the legs and required an immediate response. It was cool. It was manageable. It was what a body could move through without distress. She noted all of this in the notebook, with the precise attention she had brought to everything she had ever tried to understand. The temperature at different hours estimated by the feel of the air and by what her water bucket told her in the morning. Whether there was ice at the surface or only the stillness of cold water. She noted the wood consumed each evening, and the quality of the fire, and the weather conditions outside. Whether the wind was from the northwest as it usually was or whether something had shifted. And the cold had a different character. She was building a record. This was something George had taught her, though he would not have called it teaching. He had simply kept records in the same notebook she now used, and she had watched him keep them for 30 years, and had understood from watching that the record was not about the past. The record was about the future. It was the conversation you had with yourself across time, the way information from one winter prepared you for the next, the way a pattern you could not see in a single year became visible across a decade. She was in her first winter here. She would know more by spring. Mabel Hale came on the second Tuesday of December. She came alone in the late afternoon before the light failed, while the settlement was still active enough that her presence at Nell's door required no particular explanation. She brought a quarter loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, and she knocked and waited. And when Nell opened the door, she held it out with a directness that contained no awkwardness, no performance of generosity. She said, "I made extra." Nell took the bread and stood back, and Mabel came in. She went directly to the wall and placed her hand against it, the same motion she had used in October. The listening gesture, her head slightly tilted. She moved her hand along the surface. She was not doing this for Nell's benefit. She was doing it for her own information, the gesture of a woman who had a question and was trying to answer it through direct contact with the thing itself. She said, "Clem hasn't said anything." Nell said no. Mabel said, "But he's been reading something at the table in the evenings. He doesn't show me what it is." Nell said nothing. Mabel stood for a moment longer with her hand on the stone. Then she sat down at the table and looked at the room the way she looked at everything with the quick eyes that processed a situation faster than most people spoke. She looked at the firebox, currently cold. The fire from the previous evening long since burned to ash. She looked at the closed pine panel. She looked at the proportions of the stone mass relative to the room. She said, "My youngest sleeps closest to the floor." Nell understood what she was saying. Mabel said in the morning she has frost in her hair sometimes, from the draft that comes under the door. Nell brought her own cup to the table. She sat across from Mabel. She opened the notebook to a set of figures and turned it so Mabel could see. She did not explain the figures. She let Mabel read them. Mabel was not a woman who needed things explained. She read numbers the same way she read situations quickly and with retention. Her finger moved down the columns, and she turned the page and found the drawings on the back, and studied those for a long time. She said you could do a smaller version, against a north-facing interior wall. Nell said yes. Mabel said less stone than what you have here. Nell said a third of what I used here would change the character of the cold in a room. Mabel closed the notebook and pushed it back across the table. She was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who was not done thinking. She said, "Clem will build one." Nell said, "I expect so." Mabel said, "He won't say he got it from you. That's not how he is." Nell said, "That's fine." Mabel looked at her across the table with the expression of a woman assessing another woman for something specific. Not the social assessment of acceptance or judgment, but the deeper assessment of character. The kind of looking that told you what a person was made of. She came back the following Tuesday, and the one after. She never asked permission. She never announced herself. She came in the late afternoons with whatever she had made extra, and she sat at the table, and sometimes she asked questions, and sometimes she didn't. And Nell answered what was asked and left the rest alone. It was the most natural thing in the world, and it was the first sustained human company Nell had permitted herself since George died, though she would not have described it as permitting herself. She would have said simply that Mabel came and she did not see a reason to close the door. The months were January and February now, and the cold had moved past the stage of inconvenience into the stage of attrition. Men who had gone into winter confident about their wood supplies were running new arithmetic in January, counting what remained against what the weather was likely to demand in the weeks ahead, and finding that the two numbers did not settle into comfort. The winter was not the worst in memory, but it was steady, the kind that wore rather than struck, that did not give the warming breaks that allowed a household to recover before the next assault. At the general store, the conversations about wood had taken on the quality of conversations about money, the specific tightened quality of people who were talking about a resource that was finite and diminishing. It was in the second week of January that Rutherford Dean came to call. He arrived in the late morning, which was the kind of time that people arrived when they wanted to be seen arriving when the settlement was active, and his presence would be observed and noted. He was wearing the coat that was never dirty, and he was carrying the leather folio that he carried everywhere. And he came up the path to Nell's cabin with the easy, unhurried pace of a man making a social visit. He knocked. She opened the door. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she stepped back to admit him, and in that moment she watched his eyes move quickly around the interior of the cabin. Not obviously. He was a practiced observer, and his assessment was smooth and rapid, and could have been mistaken for simple curiosity. But she had been watching practiced observers her whole life, and she understood what he was doing. He was checking the cabin against a standard she had not been shown. He came in. He declined coffee. He sat in the chair she indicated with the ease of a man who made himself comfortable in other people's spaces as a matter of course. He said, "The winter seems to be treating you well." She said, "Well enough." He looked at the stone wall. He looked at the closed pine panel. His expression was neutral. He said, "I've been thinking about the properties I manage in this settlement, thinking about the standards the territory expects for settled claims." She waited. He said, "A structure needs to demonstrate proper habitation and improvement. Living space with appropriate sleeping arrangements, a heating system of sufficient capacity." He paused. He was not looking at her directly. He was looking at the table, the neutral look of a man presenting information. He said, "Some of what you've built here is inventive. I'll grant you that. But inventive and standard are different things." She said, "What do you mean by standard?" He looked at her then. The smile was patient in the way it had been patient in August when he handed her the contract, the smile of a man managing a process. He said, "The clause on page 4 of your contract specifies that the claim must meet settlement standards of improvement and habitation by the 1st of March. A separate sleeping room, a heating system of accepted type and capacity. Your wall is unusual, and I am not saying it doesn't work. But unusual and accepted are different things." He paused again. He said, "I would hate for you to find yourself in March without clear standing. I have some resources I could make available to help you bring the cabin up to standard. A small loan, straightforward terms. You could add the bedroom structure on the east side of the cabin, put in a proper stove, have everything squared away well before the deadline." She looked at him. He said, "Simple terms. Low interest. I've helped other settlers in similar situations." She said, "I'm sure you have." Something moved in his expression. A slight adjustment. The recalibration of a man who had just heard a sentence that might have meant more than its surface meaning. He said, "It's a genuine offer." She said, "I appreciate your concern." He left. She stood at the window and watched his horse move away from the settlement toward the town to the south, and the way he rode the straight back, and the unhurried pace of a man who had done what he came to do, and was satisfied with the outcome, told her that he believed the meeting had gone as he intended. She went to the trunk. She took out the folded paper that Silas Granger had given her on an afternoon in August, before she had known what she was looking at, before she had understood why an old man who did not know her had handed her a document without explanation. She took it to the table. She unfolded it. She read it again this time, with the specific attention of someone who knew what she was looking for. The land ordinance was federal, predating the territory's own settlement statutes by 2 decades. It defined habitation requirements in language that was clear and direct, the language of lawmakers trying to be unambiguous, which meant they had been more specific than Dean's contract clause about what constituted adequate structure. Sleeping arrangements meant a protected sleeping space. It did not specify a separate room. Heating of sufficient capacity meant capacity to maintain the interior above freezing during normal winter conditions. It did not specify iron stoves or any particular mechanism. She read the clause on page 4 of her own contract. She read it alongside the federal ordinance. She sat at the table for a long time. She understood now why Silas had given her the document. He had given it to her because he had seen what she was building, and he had seen Rutherford Dean's history. In this settlement, 2 previous claims brought to the clause on page 4 by Winters, and the specific pressure that Dean applied when Winters gave him leverage. And he had understood that the woman building the stone wall might be the first person in this settlement who was going to make it to March without needing that pressure to work. He had given her the tool because he thought she might be the one who could use it. She folded both documents together and put them in the notebook between the pages of measurements and the pages of weather records where they would be ready. Then she went out to feed the mule. February came the way February came in the north, with the particular malice of a month that had been building towards something and had finally arrived at the moment to do it. The storms in February were not the long, sustained cold of January. They were different in character. Shorter and more violent fronts that moved through fast and left landscapes transform the wind in them, capable of undoing in an hour what had taken a season to establish. The storm arrived on a night in the second week of February without significant warning. The sky had been clear at dusk, and the cold had seemed merely standard, the usual evening drop that the settlement had learned to live with. Then, sometime in the hours before midnight, The wind shifted and began to build, and by midnight the full weight of the thing had arrived. Nell was inside the hollow when it came. She felt the storm through the stone, the vibration of the wind against the exterior walls transmitted into the rock. She lay against a low, continuous hum that told her about the wind's force, the way the hull of a boat told you about the sea. She was warm. The fire had burned its 3 hours and gone out before the storm arrived, and the stone had been loaded with the night's worth of heat, and the storm was not inside her walls. She listened to it for a while, and then she went back to sleep. The cabin shook twice in the worst of it, the logs flexing against gusts that had a particular character, the kind that carried ice crystals horizontal and found every external weakness. She heard the sound of something falling outside a fence rail, or a shudder the ordinary casualties of a serious storm. Then the wind moved past its peak and began to ease, and she slept through the easing. She did not hear the knock until the storm had already quieted to a steady, hard blow. The aftermath wind that continued for hours after the main event, insistent and cold and searching. The knock was not urgent. That was the first thing she registered. It was the kind of knock that a man made when he had decided to knock and had knocked the knock of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it but was not in panic. She opened the pine panel. She swung her legs down from the hollow. She crossed the cool floor and opened the door. Clem Hale stood on her step. His coat was only half fastened, which told her the timeline of his leaving a man who had risen in the middle of a crisis and dressed faster than the crisis required, waiting for him. Snow had packed itself against one side of him, the windward side the way snow packed against posts and fence rails. His hands were in the coat pockets, and they were the hands of a man who had been cold for long enough that the hands had developed opinions. He said, "My stove cracked." He said it plainly, not in apology and not in distress, in the flat, factual tone of a man reporting a mechanical failure. The tone of someone who had decided in the 30 seconds before knocking that there was no version of this situation where pride was the relevant consideration. She stepped back from the door. He came in. He closed the door behind him. He stood for a moment just inside the threshold, not moving toward the fire. Because there was no fire, and the absence of fire in that moment, and what it meant was something she watched him take in. He moved toward the wall. He did not press his hand against it this time, with the tentative gesture of a man testing a hypothesis. He pressed his back against it, the full length of his back from his shoulders to his waist, the motion of a body seeking something specific. And he stood like that, and let the stone give what it had. She heard his breathing change. The tight, controlled breathing of someone who had been cold became something slower, something that was letting the cold go. She did not speak. She went to the firebox. She loaded it with the morning wood she kept stacked near the wall, the fine, dry hardwood she had split the previous week, and she laid it with the care she always brought to this specific task, the care that was not caution, but precision, the arrangement that made the fire burn hot and draw into the stone rather than spreading into the room and going up the flue. She struck the flint, and the flame took and began to climb, and she closed the firebox front and stepped back. The fire would burn for 3 hours. The stone would take in what it was given. That was the system. That was what the system was for. Clem had moved from the wall to the chair. He sat without being invited the way a person sat when the formalities of invitation had become beside the point. His hands came out of his pockets and he held them toward the faint warmth that was beginning to move from the wall into the air near it. Not from the fire. The wall had been loaded since dusk. It was still giving. He said the seam opened on the south side of the base. She said, "Cast iron." He said, "Yes." She said when it gets too hot too fast. He was quiet. She said, did the house drop fast before you could leave? He said, faster than I expected. Mabel and the children are at the Seavey place. They went when the stove went. She said, how long were you alone in it after the stove went? He said, an hour, maybe more. She looked at his hands. The color was coming back into them. The hours moved. The fire burned with the contained focus she had built it to burn with the sound of it. A tight, bright presence inside the stone, and she watched its progress by the sounds it made and by the quality of the warmth that began to build in the air of the room. Not the sharp, radiating heat that came from iron burning hard, but the slower and more even warmth that came from stone that was absorbing and would release. Clem did not talk much. He had not talked much the night he sat through watching the wall, and he had not talked much when he came to her door in the dark. He was not a quiet man by nature. She had heard him across the settlement at ordinary moments. The loud, easy confidence of a man at home in a place. But in her cabin he was different. He was a man encountering something he had not prepared for, and he was handling it the way certain kinds of people handled the unexpected, by going quiet and paying attention. She did not mind his quiet. She was used to quiet. She had been used to the quiet of her own company since April, and she had found it after the initial difficulty of it, something she could live inside. After 2 hours, she closed the firebox front. The last of the active flame died back to coals. The stone had what it needed. She gestured toward the hollow. He looked at it. He looked at the pine panel. He looked at her. She said nothing. She had learned that sometimes the most useful thing you could offer a person was the absence of explanation. The gesture made and held without commentary, trusting the person to understand what was being offered, without requiring them to receive it through words. He moved to the hollow. He sat on the edge of the sleeping platform, with the tentative caution of a man settling onto a surface he was not certain would hold. Then he lay back. The stone met him from 3 sides. She watched him receive it. The back wall, the ceiling of the hollow, the platform itself. All of it stone that had been holding heat since evening. And he lay inside it, the way she had been lying inside it for months. And she watched his body make the adjustment that bodies made when they encountered sustained warmth, after sustained cold. The slow unclenching, the breath moving differently. She closed the pine panel. She went to her chair by the table and opened the notebook and continued the record she had been keeping for the night. The notes about the storm's arrival and behavior, and the temperature in the room at various points. The kind of record that would tell her something useful about this wall and this winter that she could carry forward into the next one. Outside, the storm had committed to its final phase, the steady, hard blow of a system moving east that had done most of its damage and was now spending what remained. The settlement creaked and leaned and held, as settlements held as things held that had been built with enough thought for what they would face. Her cabin held. Her wall held. The warmth in the stone held. She wrote in the notebook until her hand was tired. Then she set the pencil down and folded her arms on the table and sat in the quiet of her own space. The night passed. She slept at the table in the way she had learned to sleep in a chair. The light doze of a person who had developed the skill through years of sitting up with sick animals and sick people. The sleep that was not unconscious but was rest, that restored without removing awareness. When the light came back to the window, she sat up and looked at it. The wind had eased to something ordinary. The snow had stopped. The sky through the window had the bleached flat quality of a post-storm morning that would be cold and clear and still. She heard movement from the hollow, the hinge sound. Then Clem stepped down, He stood in the room with the particular look of a man who had slept in a strange place and was assessing the experience before doing anything with it. He ran his hand along the platform. He ran his hand along the back wall of the hollow. He stood for a moment with his palm flat against the exterior face of the wall. The wall was still warm. The fire had been dead for 6 hours. He turned and looked at her. She was watching him the way she watched everything, with the patient attention of someone who was collecting information, rather than waiting for a specific outcome. She did not help him to whatever he was going to say next. She did not offer a summary of what he had just experienced, or a commentary on what it meant, or a subtle indication of what the appropriate response was. She had not built this wall to prove anything to Clem Hale. She had built it to get through the winter. Whatever Clem Hale did with what he had experienced in it was his own business. He looked at the wall for a long time. He said, "When the ground thaws." She waited. He said, "I want to start hauling stone from the creek. I want to start before the spring planting." She said the quarry on the east side gives better flat pieces than the creek bed. The limestone comes out in longer slabs there. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You knew about the quarry in September." She said, "Yes." He said, "You didn't say anything." She said, "You didn't ask." He stood there with that for a moment. Then he picked up his coat from the chair where he had left it. He said, "I'll need someone to check my proportions when I'm building." She said, "Bring your measurements to me first, before you cut the stone." He put on his coat. He moved to the door. He opened it, and the cold morning air came in, the clean, severe air of the day after a storm. And he stood in it for a moment, looking at the settlement coming back to life around him. Smoke rising from chimneys. A door opening across the way. The ordinary morning sounds resuming their ordinary morning business. He looked back at her. He said, "How much have you been burning?" She said, "I keep an account." He said, "In a month." She said, "I'll have more than half my winter supply left when the thaw comes." He stood in the doorway with the cold at his back and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and there was nothing that needed to be said beyond what had already been established by the wall, and the night, and the stone that was still warm 6 hours after the fire went out. He stepped outside. He pulled the door closed. She stood in the quiet of her cabin with the notebook open on the table, and the pine panel closed over the hollow that had held a man through the worst night of the winter, and the wall that had held through the night before, and every night before that. And she picked up the pencil and wrote the date and the temperature and the condition of the wall at first light, the record continuing in the way that records continued one day at a time, patient as stone. March arrived the way it always arrived in the north, not as a relief but as a negotiation. The hard cold of February did not simply yield. It retreated by degrees, giving back a day at a time, pulling back to the north and then returning for a few days, as if reconsidering, as if the season had not yet fully decided what it was going to be. The mornings were still sharp enough to freeze water in buckets left near doors. The afternoons offered something that was not warmth, but was the memory of warmth, a quality of light that reminded the body that such a thing was possible. In the settlement, the first week of March had a particular mood. People came out of doors more. They stood in yards and looked at the sky with the assessing eyes of people who had been paying close attention to weather for months and were now reading it for a different kind of information. The wood stacks that had started October tall were much reduced, and the remaining wood had a different status now. The status of something that had proven itself finite, in a way that confidence in September had not quite believed. Nell's supply was more than half intact. She had done the final accounting on the 1st of March, as she did every accounting precisely and without drama. She had entered the numbers in the notebook alongside the weather records and the temperature readings and the notes about the wall's performance through the season. The numbers were what she had expected them to be. She had not expected them to be otherwise. She had built the system for exactly these numbers, and the system had produced them. She did not feel triumph about this. She felt the satisfaction of a thing that had worked, because it was designed correctly, which was a different and quieter feeling than triumph, and was in her experience more reliable. Triumph required something to have been uncertain. This had not been uncertain. She had known in October what March would show. The same way she had known in September where the limestone gave its best flat pieces, and in August what the winter would cost in a north-facing cabin with no thermal mass. She had planned for exactly this March. What she had not planned for, or rather what she had understood in the abstract and was now understanding in the concrete, was that Rutherford Dean would come. He came on a Wednesday. She saw his horse before she saw him. The well-maintained horse that stood too well for this country, picking its way along the settlement track, with the careful steps of an animal that had not been shaped by difficult ground. She was at the table when she heard it outside, and she looked through the window and saw him coming, and she knew what he was carrying before he dismounted. She did not do anything fast. She went to the trunk. She took out the notebook and set it on the table open to the pages of March records. The accounting of wood consumed and the temperature readings and the notes about the wall through the season. She took out the folded papers that lived between the pages where she had put them in January. She unfolded them and laid them flat on the table side by side, Dean's contract beside the federal ordinance that Silas Granger had handed her, without explanation on an August afternoon. She read both of them again. Not because she needed to, but because the reading of a document before a confrontation was the kind of preparation that had no downside. She wanted the language fresh in her mind, the specific words rather than her memory of the words, because specific words were what mattered when the conversation came down to them. She folded them back together. She picked up the pencil and wrote the date at the top of the next empty page in the notebook. Then she waited. He knocked. She crossed to the door and opened it before the second knock. Dean was standing on her step with the folio under his arm and the coat that was never dirty, and the patient smile of a man who had done this before and understood the shape of how it went. He was wearing the smile from the first day, the August smile, the smile of someone managing a process. He said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I hope the winter has been kind." She said, "Come in." He came in. His eyes moved around the cabin in the same way they had moved in January, quickly, and with assessment checking the interior against the standard he carried. He looked at the stone wall. He looked at the pine panel. He looked at the single room, the table, the packed earth floor, the absence of a separate sleeping space in any form he recognized. He sat in the chair she indicated. She sat across from him. She did not offer coffee. He placed the folio on the table. He said, "I want to be straightforward with you as I've tried to be from the beginning. We're now in the first week of March, and I've had a chance to see how the winter has treated your claim. I have some concerns about whether the improvements meet the standard we discussed." She said, "Which standard?" He said, "The standard in your contract. Page 4. Proper habitation and improvement. Separate sleeping arrangements. Heating of accepted type and sufficient capacity." He opened the folio. He produced a copy of the contract, his copy, and he set it on the table between them. He placed his finger on the clause on page 4, and he read it aloud, in the neutral tone of a man reading something official, a tone designed to suggest that the words were simply there, simply true, simply what they were. He said, "Your sleeping arrangement is inside the wall itself. That's not a conventional bedroom. Your heating system is a masonry mass that I've never seen documented as an accepted type in this territory. I'm not saying it doesn't work. I'm saying it doesn't fit the standard the contract specifies." She said yes. He looked at her. The single word had a quality he had not been expecting, the quality of a person who had been waiting for a specific moment to arrive and was now present in it. She said, "I want to show you something." She picked up the two documents from beside the notebook and set them in front of him. He looked at them. He picked up the federal ordinance first, the older document, and he looked at it with the particular quality of a man recognizing something he would rather not have recognized. His face did not change in the way a face changed when a person was surprised. It changed in the way a face changed when a person encountered something they had been hoping was not there, and was now confirming was there. She said, "The ordinance is federal. It predates the territory's own settlement statutes. Where they conflict, the federal document governs." He said, "That's a legal interpretation." She said, "Read the language about sleeping arrangements. Read it against the language in the contract." He read it. She watched him read it. He was a precise reader, she could tell by the way his eyes moved across the page, and he was reading it precisely now, because precision was the only tool available to him, and he was using it to look for the gap she might have missed. He did not find a gap. The federal ordinance specified a protected sleeping space. Her hollow was stone on 3 sides and closed on the 4th. It was more protected than most sleeping spaces in the settlement. The clause in his contract specified separate sleeping arrangements, but separate from what was not defined. And the federal language took precedence in cases of conflict. And the federal language did not require a separate room. He set the ordinance down. He picked up her contract. He read the heating clause again. She said, "The federal language specifies capacity to maintain the interior above freezing during normal winter conditions. My notebook has the temperature records for every morning of this winter. Every morning." She turned the notebook toward him and opened it to the December records, the first month of serious cold. And she placed her finger at the column of morning temperatures. She said, "The lowest reading I recorded was at the end of January during the cold stretch. The interior was 41 degrees at 6 in the morning after the fire had been out for 9 hours. 41 is above freezing. The wall maintained it." He looked at the records. He looked at the months of them, the careful dated entries, the handwriting consistent and clear throughout the notebook, of someone who had been planning to use this document for exactly this purpose from the beginning of the season. He was quiet for a moment. She said, "The ordinance does not specify iron stoves. It specifies adequate capacity. I've documented adequate capacity for the duration of the winter." He closed the contract. He picked up the federal ordinance again and he held it, and he looked at it with the expression of a man who was doing a very fast calculation and arriving at the same answer from every direction he tried. He had used this clause twice before. Both previous times the claim had fallen short in ways that were unmistakable: cold cabins and departed residents and empty land that reverted cleanly to his control. This was different. This was a woman who had read his clause and then spent a winter building the record that answered it. He said, "Where did you get this ordinance?" She said, "Someone gave it to me." He said, "Who?" She said, "Someone who had been here long enough to know the difference between what the law says and what you say the law says." He picked up his copy of the contract and folded it and put it back in the folio. He closed the folio. He sat for a moment with his hands resting on top of it. She did not help him find the exit from the conversation. She had not constructed this moment by doing people favors, and she was not going to undermine it now by making it easier for him to leave than he deserved. She sat and looked at him with the patience of someone who had 63 years of practice at waiting for the right moment and was in no hurry now that it had arrived. He stood. He picked up the folio. He said, "The claim is valid. I don't see grounds to invoke the provision." She said, "I believe you know what this means." He looked at her one more time. The smile was gone. What was left was the face of a man looking at a situation that had not resolved the way the situations in his experience resolved. And he was looking at it with the kind of attention that might in time and with sufficient honesty amount to understanding. He said nothing more. He went to the door. He opened it. The March air came in the cold air with the edge of something else in it. Something that was not quite warmth, but was the direction of warmth. The air of a season that had committed to turning. He stepped out. He pulled the door closed. She heard his boots on the frozen ground. She heard the horse. She did not go to the window. She did not need to see him leave to know that he was leaving and what it meant that he was leaving. She sat at the table. She looked at the two documents still spread on the table before her. The federal ordinance that Silas Granger had handed her on an August afternoon without explanation, that she had put in a trunk without fully understanding and then read with full understanding on an afternoon in January when she needed to understand it. She thought about Silas. She thought about what it had required to be a man who had watched two claims go to that clause and had preserved a 20-year-old document against the specific future use of it, and had then handed that document to a woman he did not know on an afternoon in August, because something in what she was building told him she might be the one who could use it. He had not saved her. That was important, and she was clear about it. He had given her a tool. What she had done with the tool was her own work, the winter of records, and the careful documentation, and the system that had performed exactly as she had designed it to perform. The tool had been necessary. It had not been sufficient. She had supplied the rest. She stood up. She went to the door and opened it. The settlement was going about the business of a March morning, people moving between structures. Smoke from chimneys that were burning less than they had been burning in January and would burn less still by April. She stood in the doorway and looked at the sky, which was the high, thin blue of a clear, cold day, with the promise of nothing in particular but the absence of storm. She looked toward the eastern edge of the settlement. Silas Granger's cabin sat there the way it had always sat there, the oldest structure in the settlement, built by a man who had been here 20 years, and who wore that time as a quality of stillness rather than a quality of authority. A thin curl of smoke from his chimney. A woodpile on the south side of the structure that was modest and well organized. She went inside and cut 2 slices of bread from the loaf she had made 2 days before. She wrapped them in cloth. She put on her coat. She walked to his door and knocked. He opened it after a moment, the unhurried opening of a man who did not expect emergencies and was not preparing for one. He looked at her. He looked at the wrapped bread. She held it out. She said, "He came this morning. He took the bread." He said, "How did it go?" She said, "The claim is valid." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, the same slow nod he had given in August, the nod of a man confirming something he had suspected. She said, "How long did you keep the ordinance?" He said, "Since the second time he used the clause. I thought if I kept it long enough, someone would come who could use it." She said that was 20 years of keeping. He said, "I'm a patient man." She said, "Thank you." He said, "You built the wall." She said, "Yes." He said, "That's the part that mattered." She turned and walked back to her cabin. Spring came the way spring came in the north. Not with drama, but with accumulation each day slightly longer than the one before each morning. Marginally less severe, the mud that followed the thaw being its own kind of difficulty. But a different kind. A difficulty that implied the possibility of planting, and planting implied the future. By the first week of April, Clem Hale had begun hauling stone. He went to the quarry on the eastern fence line as she had suggested, and he brought back limestone in the long, flat slabs that broke cleanly from the formation there, and he stacked them beside his cabin in the methodical way of a man who had thought about dimensions and was working towards specific numbers. He had the diagrams she had drawn for him in November, and he had measured his own north wall, and he had done the arithmetic himself. He did not ask for her help. He did not announce what he was doing to the settlement in the way that some men announce their projects. He simply began. Mabel came on a Tuesday afternoon as she had come all winter, and she sat at the table and they drank coffee, and she told Nell that Clem was reading the diagrams every evening at the table, checking his measurements against the drawings. The kind of preparation that a man made when he was determined to do something correctly the first time. She said he's counting the courses in your wall through your window when he walks past. Nell said he should come in and look at it directly. Mabel said, "I'll tell him you said so." He came the following Thursday in the late afternoon with a small notebook of his own, in which he had been recording measurements. He stood before the wall for a long time, and he measured things with a piece of string he had cut to a specific length, checking the thickness at various points and the height of the firebox opening, and the depth of the hollow relative to the overall mass. He asked one question. He said, "How thick is the back wall of the sleeping space?" She said, 10 inches at the minimum, 12 where I could manage it. He made a note. She said, "The thicker it is, the longer it holds." The first night I slept in it in October. The wall held 8 hours. By January, it was holding past 10. The mass keeps absorbing season after season. The second winter will be better than the first. He said, "That's why you're not worried about having half your wood left." She said, "I have more than half because I built a system, not because I got lucky." He looked at her with the expression he had been developing all winter. The expression of a man in the process of revising a significant assumption, which was not a comfortable expression, but was an honest one. He left without ceremony the way he had come. The news about Dean's visit moved through the settlement with the efficiency that news always moved in small communities where people were paying close attention to each other's situations. She had not told anyone what had happened. She did not need to. Dean had been observed arriving and observed leaving, and the settlement had people who were skilled at reading the quality of a man's departure, and the quality of Dean's departure had said something clear about the outcome. Mabel said nothing about it directly. She came on Tuesday as she always did, and she brought bread, and she sat at the table and she talked about the planting schedule and the condition of the soil on the south end of her claim, and the question of whether to try a different variety of corn this season. Normal things. The kind of things that people talked about when the crisis had passed, and they were returning to the forward-facing concerns of ordinary life. But once while they were sitting there, Mabel looked at the wall with the expression she always used when she was actually thinking about something that had nothing to do with what she was saying. She said, "Clem's friend Harwick, the one with the place south of town. He's been asking about the wall. Nell said he can come and ask me directly. Mabel said he probably will. Nell said, tell him to bring his measurements." There were 2 more visitors before the month was out. Both men who had heard what they had heard, and who came with the careful manner of people who were going to ask for something and were not quite sure how to ask for it, from a woman they had previously found it easy to dismiss. One of them had been at the edge of her yard in September with Clem. He did not mention September. She did not mention it either. She gave them both what she gave Clem: the diagrams, the principles, the specific information about stone and mortar and the proportions that made the system work as a system, and not just as a pile of rocks in a corner. She did not charge them for it. She had thought about this question, and her answer was simple. The information was not scarce. Teaching it to one person did not reduce her ability to teach it to the next. What she had built in her cabin was not a secret worth keeping. It was knowledge, and knowledge of this kind knowledge that kept people from burning through their fuel in February, and that kept children from sleeping with frost in their hair, was the kind of knowledge that did its most useful work when it moved freely, rather than when it sat in one place. She thought about this and wrote about it in the notebook in the pages she had started reserving for observations that were not weather records or measurements, but something else. The accumulated thinking of a person working through ideas. The second winter would be better than the first, not because the weather would be different. It would probably be the steady northern cold that did not apologize and did not negotiate. But because the wall would be seasoned a mass that had cycled through a full year of charging and releasing, and had become more itself in the process, more efficient at holding what it was given. And because she would know more, every record she had kept through the first winter would be available to her in the second. Not just the abstractions of the system, but the specific behaviors of her specific wall. In her specific climate, the way it performed on different wine days and through different storm types, and under the different conditions that a full season had provided. The notebook was becoming a different kind of document. She had started it as a record. It was becoming something more than a record. It was becoming the kind of document that her father had kept in her childhood, and that George had kept through their marriage, the kind that was addressed not only to the present, and not only to the past, but to whoever came after. She wrote in it with that awareness, the awareness of address. April moved toward May. The ground softened, and the planning talk became planning action, and the settlement turned its attention to the forward work of the season. The cold was not entirely gone. It would not be entirely gone until June, and even June had its surprises. But the existential quality of the cold, the quality that had made it a survival question rather than an inconvenience, had passed. One morning in the last week of April, she walked to the creek. She walked it the way she had walked it in August the first time, with the notebook and the pencil, and the eye that was reading rather than looking. She walked the bank where the limestone was accessible, and she crouched and pressed her palm against the flat upper surface of a shelf of stone that had been under water through the winter and was now exposed by the lowering water. The stone was cool, not cold. Cool in the way that stone near water was always cool, a stable temperature that had nothing to do with the season, that the limestone maintained, regardless of what the weather was doing above it. She sat there for a while beside the creek. She thought about the winter. She thought about the wall and what it had done, and what it had shown her about the things she already knew and the things she had not yet known how to use. She thought about Mabel sitting at the table every Tuesday with questions she was learning to ask more precisely. She thought about Clem standing in the quarry with a string in his hand, measuring limestone. She thought about Silas Granger at his door, the bread in his hand, the 20-year patience of a man who had kept a document against a future use that had finally arrived. She thought about George. She had not thought about him in a specific way for a while, and now she thought about him with the quality of thinking about someone you had loved for a long time, and who was gone in the way that death made someone gone entirely and without negotiation. She thought about what he would have said about the wall and the winter and the way Dean had left. She knew what he would have said, because she had known him for 31 years, and the knowing had become a kind of internal voice that she could still consult, even when the person it had belonged to was no longer there. He would have said, "You knew it would work before you started." She would have said, "Yes." He would have said, "Then why does it feel like more than you expected?" She sat beside the creek and thought about that question. The answer was that she had expected the wool to work, because she had designed it correctly and built it carefully and understood the principles behind it well enough to predict the outcome. She had not expected what had happened around the wall. She had not expected Mabel at the table every Tuesday, or the way Silas Granger had turned out to have been watching and waiting, and had given her the one tool she needed for the one moment she needed it. She had not expected to feel at the end of March like a person who had found the place where she was going to spend the rest of her life. Not because the place was beautiful or comfortable, but because the place had asked something from her that she was capable of giving and had given it back in full. She pressed her palm against the limestone once more. It was stone. It was just stone. It was the same limestone it had been in August when she had knelt on this bank and assessed it for her purposes, and it would be the same limestone in 10 winters and 50 winters and long after she was gone. It did not know what she had done with it. It did not know about Dean or Mabel, or Silas or the pine panel, or the nights that had been warm when they should have been cold. It was indifferent in the way that stone was indifferent, the complete indifference of a thing that simply was. She had built something from that indifference. She had shaped it to her purpose and fed it heat, and it had given the heat back, and she had made a life inside that exchange, a life that was hers, in the way that lives were yours, when you had built them with your own hands from the materials available to you, and had not required them to be other than what they were. She stood up. She walked him back to the settlement along the bank, the same path she had walked in August. The ground softer now under her boots, the air carrying the particular quality of the season's turning. She could see the settlement ahead, the smoke from the morning fires still rising from most chimneys, the ordinary activity of people doing the forward work of the spring. At the edge of her claim she stopped. She looked at the cabin, the low roof, the walls she knew the interior of the way she knew her own hands, the chimney that would go dark this evening at 9 and would need no tending through the night, because the stone would do what stone did, what she had asked it to do, what it had been doing all winter without complaint or failure. She thought about what Silas had said at his door. You built the wall. Yes, she had done that. She had come north at 63 years old, with a mule and a trunk and a notebook full of ideas that she was not yet certain would work. And she had built a thing that worked and had documented its working, and had given the document to anyone who asked. She had sat at a table across from a man who had come with a folio and a clause, and the comfortable history of using both. And she had put the 2 pieces of paper on the table, and she had not needed to say very much. She walked through the door of the cabin. The air inside was cool, the spring coolness of a room after the night fire had burned through, and the morning was fresh and the season had shifted enough that she had not rebuilt it yet. She would rebuild it this evening, not because she was cold, because the rhythm of it had become the rhythm of her days, and she had come to value the rhythm as its own thing. The evening fire and the closing of the panel and the stone that held through the dark. She hung up her coat. She went to the trunk and took out the notebook. She went to the table and sat down and opened it to the next empty page. She wrote the date. She wrote the air temperature, which she could feel with the accuracy of someone who had been recording this particular measurement through a full season, and knew the difference between 48 degrees and 52 degrees, the way she knew the difference between a good harvest year and a poor one. She wrote the condition of the wall the way she always began, pressing her palm to the surface before she wrote anything else. Reading the stone the way her father had taught her to read soil, and the way she had taught herself to read everything else through the specific patient, unrepeatable attention of a person who intended to understand the thing she was working with, rather than simply use it. The wall was warm. It was always warm. She had made it warm, and it held what she had given it, and gave it back in the slow, steady way of stone. And she sat in her cabin in the April morning and wrote it down, the way she wrote everything down for herself and for the season ahead, and for whoever might come after and need to know what she had found. In the limestone country north of the river, she wrote, "The second winter will be better." Then she put the pencil down and looked through the window at the settlement going about its business in the pale spring light. And she was content in the way that a person was content when they had arrived at the right place by the right means and had work still to do and the tools to do it. The wall held the morning warmth. The window held the morning light. She picked up the pencil and kept writing,